Hi guys, this is Amfex coming at you with another episode, and I'm going to be showing you how I like to set Blender up when I use it for the first time. This is my own preference, so for sure there will be things that you will want to change. But jumping straight in, I'm a hard surface modeler, and so I like to keep my interface as clean as possible. I'm going to remove these default objects, so I don't find them very useful. I'll double press A and then X and Enter to delete them. I don't do much animation, so I'll get rid of this line down here to free up some space. I'll right click on this black line, press join area, and you see you get an arrow depending where you want to merge. I'm going to merge down. Okay, so I'll press T now to remove the tools panel quickly. And between vertex and increment, I prefer the vertex snap element. I'll show you what that does in 1 second. But at the minute, I'm going to jump to the left view, press the numpad 5 key and move 3 times to the left, twice up. And I prefer this view. It gives you a better indication of the scene when you start Blender up, and so I use that instead. So going back to the snap element, I'm going to add a cube in and go into edit mode, and you see as I select a point and hold down Control, I can now snap to any other vertex point on the object. Okay, so deleting that, I'm going to jump over to the render panel now. This controls the output for images coming out of Blender. The first thing I'm going to change is the resolution to 100%. I'm not sure why that's at 50%, but that'll be 100% of whatever resolution you input over here. That's to avoid any confusion. Now under anti-aliasing, I'm going to select 16, but keep note the higher that is, then the longer your render times will be. Jumping down to the output panel, I will change the compression ratio to 0%. The reason I do that is because I can change the compression in Photoshop, for example, and I think it's best that as you're rendering to have the best possible image quality coming out of Blender. You can also change the color depth to 16. This can reduce image banding, but keep note that some effects, for example, in Photoshop are not supported in 16-bit formats. Okay, so those are the main things in the user interface. I'm going to jump into the user preferences now. So File and User Preferences. I will jump to the leftmost tab first and maximize. Okay, so any changes I make within the preferences now, I'll try to explain at the end of the video to give you a better understanding. The first thing I'm going to begin with is auto perspective, rotate around selection and zoom to mouse position. Then under editing, I'm going to change my undo steps to 72 just to give me some leeway, and grease pencil I'm going to put on smooth stroke and simplify stroke. Okay, so moving on to input. If you're coming from another application, keep note Blender does give you the option to change the keyboard layout. I can't comment on what they're like, so you might want to play around with those, but it's there nevertheless. I'm going to change my double click speed to 200, that is up to you. And the orbit style is again something you want to play around with. The difference between these two settings is that turntable works on one axis, and trackball allows you a more tactile way of navigating around the 3D viewport. I like personally the trackball. It takes a bit more getting used to, but I find it's better when you are doing more complex objects. I'll show you what that does later. Okay, jumping over to the add-ons. If you're adding new add-ons into Blender, then they will come under one of these categories over here. You can just select one of these categories and you see they're organized into different sections. To activate a add-on, you just want to select this little box here. There's like a little man who's jumping. So you put a tick in there and it's activated. And that's it. Okay, so jumping over to themes. I like that you can customize Blender. It's one of the really nice features about it. And you see here you have different categories where you can change the colors, the gradients, and so on and so on. For the most of us, it's probably a little bit more complex than we want, and so Blender gives us quite a few presets that we can use. I like the Elysian one, so I'm going to select that and jump over to File. Okay, so there's some important settings here, which I'll try to explain. Show thumbnails. I will show you in a minute, and compress file. Now compress file, I haven't noticed any negative effects with activating it, but neither have I really noticed any difference in the file size, but I put it on because, you know, free space, why not? Okay, so the temp selection over here, this is really important, because if you're using something like CC Cleaner, then you will, by default, CC Cleaner will clean out those local temp files. Whether you're right-click cleaning, for example, or something like this, and Blender makes backups every few minutes, which you can change over here under this option. And if you have a crash or you say you have a problem with Blender and you want to go back and you don't have any undo steps, then you will not have that file. So I recommend making a new temp folder under Documents. You see I've already created one here, so I'm going to select that and then just press Accept. And that just gives you some reassurance. Now the show thumbnails, if I go to textures here, for example, and I go to D in my art and find some pictures for no particular reason, then you see here I have a default list view, and if I select this 4-image icon, then you see I get this kind of thumbnail preview. And for the most of us this will be more useful because you can see your textures and you can see your images, and then it just makes navigating around a little easier. But for sure there might be some people out there who find the list view slightly more convenient. You've got thousands and thousands of files, for example, then it's probably not so good. Okay, also keep note, you can select your fonts folder and your render output and so on and so on. Right, so moving on to system, I have SLI graphics cards by NVIDIA, so I'm going to select CUDA, and by default Blender selects both of them. If you're on an AMD system, then you should have an OpenCL option here. Now I'm not completely sure whether it comes up. I'm not sure if that's a graphical build or a daily build option or something like that, so don't take my word for it. Now under OpenGL, I'm going to turn on VBOs and region overlap. I'll show you what those do in a second. But for the meantime, we're finished in this section, so I'm going to save user settings and close the window down. And before we forget, we'll go to File and Save Startup File here. That just means that when you start Blender up for the first time, then you'll have this scene. Okay, so to start demonstrating what these settings do, if I press T and N to open up the View and Tools panel, and if I move around, you'll see that the grid is viewable underneath the panels, and region overlap just gives you a better sense of space. It's a bit of eye candy, but I find it, I like it. It gives you a bit more space to work with, and so I put it on. Okay, so if I add in an object here now, another cube, and I go into edit mode, you'll see that rotate around selection just means as I select a point, Blender's going to rotate around that point. Okay, pretty self-explanatory. And zoom to mouse position is the same. Wherever I put my cursor, Blender will zoom to. Auto perspective is another feature which is simple but very useful. For the most of us, if you're a hard surface modeler, maybe not so much for the organic ones out there, but you're going to be modeling from reference images, from blueprints, things like that. By default, Blender uses a perspective view. That's what you get in your world around you. We're living in a perspective environment, and so this is how it will look. But if I jump to a left, top, right, no particular order, if I go to any of these views down here, you see Blender automatically goes to an orthographic view. So this is something more likened to a blueprint, for example. And as I move around with the middle mouse button, you see it switches over to perspective view automatically. A little useful, little feature, but put it on. I think you'll find it useful. So deleting the cube now. Now the grease pencil tool is another interesting feature within Blender. As I hold down D and left click and draw, you see I can create these black lines. The smooth stroke and those other settings that I changed within the preferences, you'll see that if I make it a bit jittery, you see it kind of smooths it out. The grease pencil tool is quite useful. It has a few different applications. The one, for example, is retopology, where you can draw on the surface of objects and imply where the topology should be made. Another one is where, for example, if you made a group of rocks and you wanted to scatter these rocks around the surface or some terrain, then you would use the grease pencil tool to tell Blender where you want those points of scattering, or where you want the rocks to appear, basically. Okay, so I think that's basically all the different settings there. This is how I like my Blender setup. So absolutely change and play around with what you want. But for the time being, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please subscribe and see you soon.